may I introduce our speaker tonight? It gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Margaret Rees. She has a long-standing, unique portfolio of experience of research and publication ethics, combined with an international reputation in leadership in women's health. She chaired an NHS Research Ethics Committee, the Association for Research Ethics, and is also a member of the Open University Research Ethics Committee. She is Editor-in-Chief of Case Reports in Women's Health and Executive Director of the European Menopause and Andropause Society. She is Reader Emeritus in Reproductive Medicine at the University of Oxford, Visiting Professor of the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Glasgow, and Associate Professor at the Robert Wood Johnson Medical School, Rutgers University. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Rees, who is going to talk tonight on truth and trust in medical publication. Thank you.
Anyway, thank you, Kay, for this very nice introduction. So, as you heard, I'm a medical doctor with a research background. So that's the picture on the first slide of me in my Oxford DPhil gown. And I'm currently editing the case reports in women's health. And this afternoon, I was appointed the first Trust and Transparency editor in women's health for Elsevier. So what do editors want to do? They want to publish honest, reproducible data without data fabrication, falsification, duplication, salami slice, or plagiarism. Basically, the truth. And if studies are submitted, the way in which they have been undertaken or written up need to comply with international guidelines. And the picture on the left is of an ivory tower, and no, editors do not live in ivory towers. So things can go wrong, and this will have consequences. And it can go wrong in all specialties, not just medicine, so physics, chemistry, geology, history, the arts, whatever. But for medicine, this has very wide-ranging consequences because it affects people's health. So when things go wrong, there's misinformation, there's lack of trust in research, and in particular medical research. There's a waste of research money. So money from, say, the Medical Research Council in the UK will have been wasted. People writing medical guidelines may not realise that the research has been fabricated or falsified, so the guidelines are wrong. The treatments are wrong, and not just ordinary medicines, but also vaccines. So there's now the term vaccine hesitancy, with people reluctant to become vaccinated. And the two greatest examples are for MMR and for COVID vaccines. So here's an editor on the tightrope. And I'm going to talk first about losing trust with the MMR and autism paper, which was published in the Lancet in 1998. The retractions regarding COVID-19 studies last year and this year. All journals are not the same, and talk about predatory journals. And what do editors in good peer-reviewed journals do, the publication process, and how screening is undertaken by editors before anything goes to peer review to check if there's anything obviously wrong with the paper. The process is not foolproof. So errors do get published despite best efforts. So post-publication, the science can be corrected, and whistleblowers play an important role in that purpose. So the MMR vaccine and autism story. In 1998, the Lancet published a paper, and this was a case series of 12 children. It reported a proposed new syndrome of enterocolitis and regressive autism, and associated this with MMR as an apparent precipitating event. But investigation revealed only one child clearly had regressive autism. The patient records were altered by the lead author, Andrew Wakefield. The patients were recruited through anti-MMR campaigners, and the study was commissioned and funded for planned litigation of vaccine manufacturers. And Andrew Wakefield had commercial interests, not only him, but also his wife, to develop products based on the MMR claim. And these were products such as diagnostic tests for this new syndrome, or different types of vaccines. There was an investigation. It led to a further investigation by the General Medical Council, which lasted 217 days. And I think that's the longest one on record. Andrew Wakefield was stuck off the medical register for many counts, especially counts of dishonesty. The investigative journalist Brian Deere played a significant role in exposing what had happened, and in the BMJ in January 2011, he wrote the story in 3 articles. He's also published a book. The paper was retracted 12 years later in 2010. And this had consequences. So there was a reduced use of vaccines, all of them, not just MMR. There was the anti-vaccine movement, and there was an increase in cases not only of measles, but also whooping cough, flu, polio, dengue, and that's to name but a few. Now, the World Health Organization published a report in collaboration with the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention last year. And they found that the numbers of measles deaths in 2019 was 207,500 worldwide. There was a global surge in reported measles cases. There has also been vaccine hesitancy for COVID, and the main problem is deaths which could have been prevented by vaccination were not. So now we have the term vaccine hesitancy, and I found an excellent article in the Pharmaceutical Journal, which was published in April of this year. And if you Google it, you don't have to pay to view it. So what is vaccine hesitancy? It's delaying or refusing vaccines despite the availability of vaccine services. It's reported in more than 90 countries worldwide, And it doesn't depend if it's what type of income level that country is. The World Health Organization listed vaccine hesitancy as one of the top 10 threats to global health in 2019. In 2017, in the UK, measles was eliminated, but the elimination status was lost in 2019 because there was an increase in cases and there was a suboptimal uptake of the MMR vaccine. And a UK study of over 30,000 adults found that 16% of them were distrustful of vaccines in general. This article has a very nice figure about vaccine hesitancy and the reasons. So there's 3 reasons: complacency, convenience, and confidence. So complacency, the risk of the disease is low. And we know for COVID, it isn't. The difficulty in obtaining vaccine, I can't be bothered to go and do this. And then there's trust in vaccine themselves and in the system that delivers them. So now we fast forward to 2020 and the COVID-19 papers. And I'm going to give an example of 2 papers that have been retracted or withdrawn. So in May 2020, on the 22nd, the Lancet published a paper saying that hydroxychloroquine was effective for the treatment of COVID. Hydroxychloroquine is used for malaria, rheumatoid arthritis, and systemic lupus. And soon after publication, the paper was attacked by experts who questioned how a small company called Surgisphere, with little experience in big data analysis, could have collected and analysed tens of thousands of patients' records from hundreds of hospitals worldwide. And on the 13th of June, the Lancet retracted the paper. There was a similar paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine, again with data collected by Surgisphere, that was retracted. And the lead authors, who were US-based, felt that they had been duped. And hydroxychloroquine does have significant side effects, some of which are causing problems with heart rhythm and can cause cardiac arrest in people who are susceptible to heart disease. Then there was the COVID ivermectin study. So a large Egyptian study claimed that ivermectin was effective for COVID. Ivermectin is used to treat parasites in both humans and animals. And they had posted the paper as a preprint on a preprint server. Preprints are not peer-reviewed or assessed papers. It was posted in November, and then a student based in London was asked to look at the paper, and they found that the data had been fabricated. The paper was withdrawn from the preprint server in July of this year. So when you look at a report of a treatment being effective, you need to find out what level of scrutiny has this report received. So you've got preprints, preproofs, prepress, and these are very confusing. So preprints are versions of manuscripts that precede peer review and publication in a peer-reviewed journal. Preprints have been used in physics and chemistry for many years because it's a way of putting out your research, getting comments before you submit it to peer review. However, there's been an explosion with COVID of putting medical papers on preprint servers. There are many preprint servers and they have different levels of scrutiny. If something is peer reviewed, the paper could be rejected, or it may have been recommended for significant revision. And once a paper has been accepted after peer review, it then becomes either a preproof or prepress article. But these are uncorrected proofs, which may still be modified as the authors check the proofs and correct typesetter errors. The media need to specify what stage the study is. And in May 2020, I was looking at the BBC and it just talked about a study, but now it says very clearly this is a preprint which has not been peer reviewed or published in a scientific journal. Then the next thing to think about is that not all journals are the same. And there are predatory or untrustworthy journals. These are, in fact, commercial companies that publish without peer review for monetary gain. I get at least 20 invitations per day from such companies, and they usually start, greetings of the day, I have seen your profile, we are completing an issue, please submit within the next 2 days and we will reduce the publication fee. And the definition from the Committee on Publication Ethics was that predatory journals and publishers are entities that prioritize self-interest at the expense of scholarship and are characterized by false or misleading information. And it's now thought that publishing in a predatory journal constitutes scientific misconduct. Though it's very tempting for junior researchers, when they've had their paper rejected for the 5th time, to submit something to a predatory journal. So if you see something published on Google and you're not sure about the journal, this is how you can check. So for medical journals, they're not on a recognized database such as PubMed or Medline. The journal website is basically amateurish and has spelling and grammatical errors. The street address is questionable for a publisher. There are few or no published articles available. The editorial board is not listed. There could be the wrong expertise, or the editors could be dead. An example was Sir Richard Doll, who was known for his research associating smoking with lung cancer, who was listed as an editor on a predatory journal publishing work in physics. And most libraries now are wise to this and will have checklists for their students about How can you pick that this journal is predatory? Then we have a new kid on the block, which is the hijacked or cloned journals. And these are journals, in fact, commercial companies that mimic legitimate publishers by creating a clone website or registering an expired one. And they accept absolutely anything without peer review and collect fees from the authors. And this causes huge problems for databases. And the World Health Organization, and here's the link on Retraction Watch, had a news item about how its COVID-19 library contained hundreds of papers from hijacked journals, and these were nonsense papers, and these had to be picked out. And this creates a huge amount of work. So what happens in the normal publication process in a peer-reviewed journal? So authors submit their papers, and there are various editorial systems such as Scholar One, Editorial Manager. Administrators check that all the files are present, so it can then go to the next phase, which is the editor. The systems also notify all the authors with the emails provided that a paper has been submitted in their name. Editors then look at the paper and might reject it. It might be because it's failed screening. It might be because the science looks dodgy. It could be because it's out of scope for the journal. But if the editors feel that it has passed all these tests, it then goes to peer review. And then there's three possibilities: rejection, revision, or acceptance. Acceptance is rare except for editorials or comment papers. Revision may go in several cycles. The peer review process usually involves two reviewers with a third person in case there is dissent, and there may be statistical review with the statistician looking to see if the study was appropriately designed or analysed. So, what do editors do when they screen a paper? The first one is plagiarism. The next is duplicate or salami slice submissions. Authors and contributors, so gift, dropped, ghost, medical writers, fake authors. Conflicts of interest, which could be true or false. The funding statement, is it true or false? If it's a clinical trial of a new medicine, has this been registered? Is there ethical approval and consent for this study? So plagiarism. There are two main types. An author uses somebody else's work without permission, credit, or acknowledgement. Then there's self-plagiarism or text recycling, where the writer republishes a work in its entirety or reuses portions of a previously written text while authoring a new work. This could be acceptable if it's a big study, say, which is generating hundreds of paper where the methods section may be very similar from one paper to the next, because each paper has to stand alone for the readership. This may also pertain to the introduction of the paper, but certainly not to the results. Then there are different forms of plagiarism. There could be copying, there can be paraphrasing, or there could be translation into another language. And journal submissions are routinely screened for plagiarism using Authenticate. Now, this is a publicly available stock photograph of what I see when I click on the Authenticate screen. So you get a percentage of overlap, and then you have highlights about where it is and where it came from. Now, there's no absolute figure, but most people get wary if the overlap score is more than 30%. And with this overlap score, 38%, one would look quite closely. Then we have duplicate or salami slice submissions. So duplicate publication involves reporting the same data in 2 or more publications. And once it's picked up, the second publication will be retracted. Salami slicing is breaking up or segmenting a large study into 2 or more publications. And this distorts the evidence base for clinical guidelines, because if you're not careful, you think that this study involved 1,000 patients, but in fact, it's the same 100 patients reported 10 times. And Authenticate helps pick up duplicate and salami slicing. Then we come to authorship. What do you have to do to be an author on a paper? You need to have contributed to the conception, design, data collection, analysis, and interpretation of the data. And for case reports, have been involved in patient care, because that is important to check that valid consent for publication of the case report was obtained from the patient. The authors must also have drafted and revised the article, and all have approved the final version to be published. But just getting the research funding, data collection, data entry, patient care on its own, supervision of the research group, that's the head of department, providing a writing service on its own does not constitute authorship, but these people can be acknowledged. So what problems do I look out for? So there's the impossibly short or long author lists. So if you see a clinical study, say, of 200 patients with a single author, you start getting concerned. Are there missing authors? Did this person actually fabricate the submission? And there are cases which you can find on the net which show this to be the case. Then there's the long author lists. So are there gift authors, such as the head of department, or as in this cartoon, no, it's my wife's turn to be the first author on your paper. During the process of revision, the author lists can change. Some may be dropped, some may be added. Authors advise not to do this because the whole publication process stops at that stage, because all authors added and dropped have to consent to this change of authorship. It has to be justified, and they have to provide documentation in writing that they consent to this. Then you have fake authors and co-authors. So the common scenario is that you have somebody who publishes under somebody else's name. We don't know their motivation. It is very difficult, virtually impossible to find out who these people are. And the motive seems to be to alter the reputation of the well-known academic or their university or institution. So you get a paper that doesn't seem quite right, and the email address is not the usual academic address, but it's a Gmail or a Yahoo address. You hope to try and pick this up before publication. And one way of doing this is to contact the named author using their academic address and saying, did you submit a paper to my journal with this title? And if they did not, the publishers and the institution's legal services need to interact so that you can start an investigation to try and find out who this individual was, because it might be somebody within the department or who has recently left it, who has got a grudge. Then there's submissions from commercial companies or medical writing organization. Medical writers provide a great service to ensure that papers, especially coming from authors who are not native English speakers, are prepared to a level that is suitable for consideration for publication. But what is of concern is when the emails all are from people from the commercial company and do not correspond to the named academic authors. So this is a cause for rejection, and also to contact the named academic authors using their academic emails and saying, did you submit a paper? Did you know you were listed as an author? Authorship disputes and before and after publication should be avoided, and after publication can lead to a paper being retracted. Then you have a combination of the plagiarism checker and the checks for authorship, which then pick up something else. These are called paper mills. These are companies who manufacture manuscripts for submission to a journal for a fee on behalf of researchers, with the purpose of providing an easy publication for them. And they can also offer authorship for sale after a paper has been accepted. These paper mills were first called the China Bazaar in 2016 because most of these companies were based in China. And then there was the Iran Bazaar because some of these companies were based in Iran. So this picture comes from the organization called Retraction Watch, where it talks about a researcher losing their medical degree because they had used a paper mill to write the dissertation. So how can you hopefully pick this up? Faked or manipulated data or images. Use of stock images, that comes up with authenticate. Changes of authorship. Plagiarism, however, may not always be detected because the paper mill companies may paraphrase. But the text often looks a bit funny because they are translating versions from other article. They may be using computer text generators. So you can get tortured phrases such as counterfeit consciousness rather than artificial intelligence. Now, authors need to supply their conflicts of interest statements, and these may be financial and non-financial. And the International Council of Medical Journal Editors has got a standard form. And if an author says no conflict of interest, and you know from their previous publications that they have, you have to question it. But conflict of interest also pertains to reviewers and to editors, so that if a reviewer has a conflict of interest with a paper that they're going to peer review, either they're working in the same department or have published with one of the authors, they need to declare it. And for editors, if they are handling a paper that comes from their institution, it is best that they transfer it to another editor. And this is also then stated on the published paper. So the process is transparent. Funding. Studies could be funded by research councils, such as the Medical Research Council, or it could be funded by a drug company. And who funded it and what their role was in writing the paper needs to be stated, because if this information is not provided, it could be considered that the authors are trying to deceive readers. Clinical trial registration. This is a condition for publication of clinical trials and has been since around 2011. Studies that started before then were allowed to register retrospectively. And you need to see on the paper the clinical trial registration number and the date, because it must have been before the onset of patient enrollment in that clinical trial. And lack of registration documentation is a red flag, because you are concerned that the data might have been fabricated. Then there is lack of ethical approval. Since the Nuremberg trials of the doctors undertaking an experimentation in concentration camp inmates, ethical approval has been required. And this was stated by the World Medical Association, which was founded in the mid-1940s. So ethical approval is required for most studies involving people. but legislation varies worldwide, because there are some studies, say looking at audit, say a study of a hospital who admitted X cases of COVID and what was the outcome. This would be an audit, and ethical approval is not required. And ethical approval has to have been obtained before the study started and before the first patient was recruited. The Health Research Authority in the UK does not give retrospective ethical approval for clinical research. And the ethical approval statement should give the name or names of ethics committees, if there are many centres for the study, the reference numbers, and the dates of approval. And if ethical approval is not required for that type of study in that country, the reason should be given. Lack of ethical approval is another red flag. Consent. You need assurance that the people who were involved in a research study consented to take part in it. You need assurance that if a case report or cases, several unusual cases are reported in the literature, that the patients consented for their not their personal details, but their de-identified details to be published. There are certain exceptions, such as anonymized retrospective data collection, audit, service evaluation, but this needs to be documented. Consent for treatment, saying to have surgery, does not cover consent for publication. If patients can't give consent because they could be under legal age, such as children under the age of 18, or lack mental capacity, or are deceased, their legal representative can give consent on their behalf. The legal age for providing consent varies between countries. And again, legal representatives need to be recognised legal and approved representatives. Now the paper has been accepted and the editor gets a letter from a whistleblower. The article, which has been published, is criticised, and it says, we think there are problems with this paper. The concerns could be from somebody who creates another email address, so an anonymous whistleblower, or it could be not anonymous. The tone may be aggressive, and the criticism may refer to a publication many years ago when there were no electronic publication systems, so it's impossible to get the records of what happened to that submission, and the authors might be dead. So the first thing that happens after taking a deep breath when you receive this email is to assess the validity of the claim. So the editor and the publisher and several editors may look at this. They may be sour grapes. I had one which said, the authors don't belong to this department in this hospital because this department does not exist on the hospital website. So I contacted the authors, who said the department does exist, but they had a problem with the website, and they corrected the website and they gave me a photograph of the entrance of their department in their hospital. Some of the claims may be extremely valid, and the process of investigation is lengthy. One has to start by contacting the authors and also asking the institution or university where the research was done to investigate, and to obtain information from different sources to find out if the critique is valid or not. I'm now going to give the example of two whistleblowers who have played a significant role in correcting published papers. So Elizabeth Beek is a microbiologist whose specialty is picking up image manipulation. So she's got a Twitter feed, and this image is publicly available, and it was published in The Guardian a few weeks ago. So these are supposed to be two different experiments, but this picture and that picture are the same. So the results are false. Then we have the group of whistleblowers, Andrew Gray and Mark Boland, who are based in New Zealand, and Alison Avenell in Aberdeen. Now, they got concerned about publications of osteoporosis undertaken by two Japanese authors. And their investigations and their request for journals to investigate has led to 186 retractions. And what was found on investigation, which started off with a request to editors from this group, were data fabrication, unbelievable results. A small hospital could not recruit 1,000 patients in 6 months with a rare condition, publishing the same thing twice, no evidence that the research was done in the first place. And the investigations have involved institutions in both Japan and the US, where Iamoto worked for a couple of years. The problem is exacerbated is that Sato died a few years ago, and now Hyun Iamoto does not respond to emails. And this is what it looks like when you see a paper has been retracted. So if you're interested in this, you can look on the Committee on Publication Ethics Guidelines, COPE, Retraction Watch, which is updated once a week with retractions worldwide in all fields. And then for post-publication peer review, the PubPeer Foundation. They thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed this talk.
Thank you very much indeed, Margaret. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
Hello, Margaret. Sue here. It seems to be an absolute minefield for those of us who are just members of the public when reading a publication in a magazine that we thought was quite trustworthy. I'm not sure about asking a question as much to say that while I'm sure aware of things that happen, the difficulties of working your way through all of this as a member of the public is quite immense. You've given us a lot of leads, but it's a huge amount of information.
Can I say I would totally concur with this, which is why when I look at the BBC website, when it says new study shows, and then they're very good about saying this is on a preprint server and hasn't been peer reviewed. And journalists are getting more and more responsible about this.
That's interesting.
So basically, don't believe everything at face value.
The BBC maybe is on the ball.
The BBC is on the ball.
Thank you.
Margaret, I was going to ask with regard to predatory journals. I guess there's nothing much we can do about those. They exist, they'll keep existing, I guess. And I suppose the only way to deal with them is for them to be discredited. Is there anything that you think that can be done within the academic world to help alleviate the problem of predatory journals?
Basically, librarians have websites about saying how to pick up a predatory journal.
Yes.
And I know the Open University has that, Rutgers has that. There are checklists, think, check, submit. There was a librarian called Jeffrey Beale who was in Denver, who had Beale's list, and everybody looked at this avidly because every January he was updating it. And then he suddenly took it down for reasons nobody knows why. So it's been replaced by Cabell's list, but that's paid for view. But look at the website. It's really quite self-evident that these journals are not the full shilling, and these are commercial companies.
Can I ask, do you think that it's becoming more common, or have the ways of actually identifying it become more sophisticated in terms of being able to pick up plagiarism and using artificial intelligence and using various IT things to actually identify it more easily? Has it always gone on? It's easier to pick it up.
It has always gone on. The first paper I was ever sent to peer review was in the early 80s. And there was no internet. The books on publications, you had to look at basically the equivalent of big dictionaries in the library. And I thought, I've read this before. And yes, I had 13 times. So plagiarism is going up, but the tools are better, but people try and get around it. And therefore, it's a question of using your common sense. Does this, have I seen this before? It's more and more vigilance.
May I come back in, Margaret? I hope you don't mind me asking a second question. When we come to some foreign publications, perhaps from somewhere like Russia, maybe,
Yes.
Can we follow the same sort of process to check, or does that become so much more difficult?
The process should exist for all reputable publishers. And one way of different way of looking at things is that reputable publishers and journals are members of COPE. And if they're not members of COPE, then they're not considered to be necessarily reputable journals. When I was on COPE Council, we used to screen the applications to see if they followed the recognised processes of screening, peer review, etc. So that it is in a foreign language should not exclude them for doing things to a high standard.
Yes. Thank you.
Well, perhaps I should draw the evening to a close now. I'd like to thank Margaret again on behalf of the DPhil and on behalf of everyone present tonight. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. There's certainly a lot to take in, and the recording of this talk will be available on YouTube in a few days' time. So if you want to come back to some of the points that Margaret made, you can do that on our YouTube channel. Thank you again, and we hope to see you on Zoom and in person before too long at the DPhil. Good night.
Thank you very,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Night.